Today's episode is brought to you by RIMOL Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. RIMOL Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit RIMOLGreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a RIMOL tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process, so make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by Growing for Market magazine. For 31 years, Growing for Market magazine has been the source of practical ideas and information for direct market vegetable and flower growers. All articles are written by farmers who get their hands dirty and know what they're doing. If you do farmers markets, CSA, farm stand, pick your own, florist sales, or wholesaling, whether you're a commercial grower or want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market for the nitty-gritty details of growing, marketing, and the business of small farming. Available as paper magazine and a digital download with thousands of archived articles available. Use the coupon code WORM, that's WORM, to get 25% off any subscription at growingformarket.com. All right, let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, Episode 7, Season 4. Got a really awesome episode for you all this week with Dawson Mehalko of Jubilant Farms in Texas. I feel like I've been aware of Dawson's work for like 4 years now, but he's only 17 years old. Dawson got into farming at a really young age when his father got him into gardening. He's incredibly thoughtful about his market garden and soil health. So I was excited to have Dawson on to talk about farming in the context of running a business and a market garden, especially at his age. We talk about his low-tech approach and solutions to the heat down there. We discuss his markets as well as some of the challenges he's faced and mistakes he's made. I ask him about the deep compost mulch system and how that works in his hotter context, and a whole bunch else. Really, really fun episode, and it was great to catch up with Dawson. Texas has honestly not received enough love from this podcast for as big and diverse as it is, so my bad, Texas. First, before we get going, Hannah and I are headed to England in January 2022, and we will be at the Oxford Real Farming Conference at a now sold-out event with Charles Dowding at Oxton Organics. I'm going to try and get some footage from that for you all, but we will also be at Sitopia on January 8th, 2022, a farm basically inside of London, presenting with author Carolyn Steele. The tickets for that are now for sale. We'll put a link, so snag them because they are limited. And for anyone who can't make any of those events, I will be working to record absolutely as much as possible because that's kind of how we roll. We just try to make the information we have free and accessible, and if you appreciate that work and you're one of the over 10,000 people who we estimate tune into this podcast every week, but not one of the 650 patrons who support it, consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/no-till-growers. There are discounts on merch, like the hats, which I think are almost sold out for the year, but you can check. In the book, The Living Soil Handbook, and future no-till growers events, but also at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Pear Tree Hill Farm, Stephen Smith, Oh High Roots, Veggie Cropper, Scott Snodgrass, Jay Mill, Jacob Arthur, and Yannick LaPlante. Big thanks to anyone and everyone who supports our show in whatever way that you can. And enough from me. Let's get into this amazing show with Dawson Mehalko of Jubilant Farms. Dawson Mehalko, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm honored to be here.
And I'm honored to have you. You've been a big supporter and been around since the beginning. So let's just start where we always start with this podcast. Give us the rundown. Where are you located? How much land are you working on there? And those sorts of things.
I'm located in North Texas, about an hour northeast of Dallas. I'm growing on about 1/4 of an acre. I grow in 25-foot beds, so I have just over 125-foot beds. And I have a bit of greenhouse space. The climate is quite hot. In summer, we average 97, 98 degrees every day, and it's also very humid here.
Are you growing in the summer? Are you trying to, because I know a lot of people in your region often don't bother with the summer.
Growing may be a bit of an overstatement. I'm trying to grow during the summer.
Okay.
I grow year round, and I've had production year round for the past few years now. But during the summer, there's definitely a lull as crops fail.
Right. Yeah, that happens. I mean, it feels like it's happening a lot more for us too. It's getting, some of the summers are blistering and brutally hot. Give us a little bit more of an idea of your, rainfall and those sorts of things. Like, I feel like Texas has kind of got two different sides to it, right? Like there's sort of more of a desert side and more of a rainy side. Like, what, am I right in that? And also, where are you on that?
Yes, you are right about that. West Texas is more the dry side, and I'm definitely more in East Texas, where we do get more rain. I get about 37 inches of rain a year. It's very, very dry in the summer. We'll go at least 4 months usually without any rain, but we get a lot of rain early spring, and we usually get a good rain in the fall also, although this fall has been a bit of a dry one. Right.
And then we talked for a second there about producing in the summer. Are you going year round?
Yes, I'm actually in the middle of planting a lot of stuff for this winter and early spring.
Is the majority of that, can you do that in the field, or is it something that you have to do out, mostly undercover, or like what's your winters like?
My winters are just cold enough to make it a bit difficult. So I'll use frost cloth, and that usually works to a decent amount. The biggest issue I actually find during winter is a combination of heat, humidity, and cold, because my winters are not static cold. We range between having a cold spell and then quite warm, where it'll be 60s, 70s for like a week, and then cold again. And that ends up causing so that I'll get frost damage, and then it'll warm up, and that frost damage will start to decompose and then cause disease and such. And so that's where it begins to be more of an issue growing during winter. So I'm able to grow outdoors, but it does require agribon, and then I also grow indoors in the areas that I can, based on how much indoor growing I have. I have one 30 by 36 greenhouse, and I have two caterpillar tunnels from former friend.
Yeah, that I had never really thought about dealing with a situation where your fluctuations are that intense, like in the middle of the winter time.
Yeah, we'll get down into like the teens, usually maybe twice in a winter, and the rest of it is more in the 20s. Although last winter it got down to negative temperatures, and that was quite unprecedented here in my location.
Oh, right. Texas had that big ice storm, right?
Yeah, I didn't have so much going right when that happened, but most of what I did have, I just had to let it go. I was able to get my lettuce and broccoli to survive inside my cat tunnels. Other than that, I just had to let everything else go because it just wasn't going to work.
Yeah, that's intense. Well, tell us a little bit about your markets. Like, where does the produce go?
So right now, I'm distributing all of my products actually through a food hub in the area. They're a farmer created food hub where I sell my items through them, and that they're the ones that make the deliveries to the restaurants, and they also now do home deliveries. And so they're the ones that are responsible for taking payments and making the actual deliveries. So I just take my product to their distribution site, and then they distribute it from there. And I sell my items through either talking directly to some of the chefs, and then the orders go through the food hub in terms of delivery and such, or it's listed on their online store, where the restaurant and home delivery customers are able to order directly.
All right, so you're probably having to do like a fresh sheet for them essentially every week, and then upload that, like adjust your counts, your inventory. Is that how that works?
Yeah, I'm able to update my inventory online through their online portal. They use some software that it's called Local Food Marketplace. I think a few of the people who've been on the podcast have actually used that. But that's what the site is built on. And this is where I sell everything through right now. But in the past, I've done farmers markets. I've done a farmers market and a small CSA.
Okay. All right. Well, let's start. I would kind of want to get a little bit of your background because I know that, when I was back in high school, food and agriculture was kind of the furthest thing from my mind. So I'm curious what got you interested in market gardening to begin with.
Well, we should probably back up a little bit more in that my dad first got me into gardening when I was very young, 4 or 5. And then several years later, my dad got me into gardening then, and my parents gave me a book from Elliot Coleman. I don't think they knew that he was a market gardener when they gave me the book, but I didn't actually read that book until many years later when I was maybe 12. But I read that, and that's what initially got me. That is what initially made me so that I recognized that people were growing vegetables on small acreage for a living. And then I happened across Curtis Stone's YouTube channel by accident. And I went, well, if he's managing to grow so much on such a small area, then maybe I can do an even smaller version of what he's doing. And at that point, I was about 12, 13, and that's when I first began growing. And I made my first commercial sales when I was 13. So that was back in 2017.
Wow. What was your sort of equipment setup then? Did you have a BCS and doing the plow, or were you doing it by hand, or what was that? What did that look like, and how has that evolved?
This is actually the original reason why I started doing no-till, because I had no money. I had absolutely no money. I spent maybe $1,200 in total that I had made through various small jobs, and that was enough for me to be able to build a very small nursery, a very small heated nursery, 8x8, and I bought a few very basic supplies, compost, fertilizer, and I began doing it by hand, and it did not go very well in the beginning, but that's how it started, and everything has evolved from there.
And did your parents just have a chunk of land that, available to you?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. I'm growing on my parents' land. We live on 20 acres here, and so most of it is not farmable, but there's a section. It's actually where the original garden that my dad first created when I was 4, and he since has stopped gardening for a very long time, but part of the area that I'm growing on is what was once that old garden. So it's just my parents' land.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so what's the equipment? How has that changed since you were 13 and getting your first sales?
Yeah, it hasn't changed much. It evolved from I wasn't actually doing no-till in the beginning. I was digging things out by hand, and I realized that was just taking way too much time. And so it evolved to me using silage tarps and compost and doing broad forking. And so now I farm with a broad fork, rake, shovel for compost, wheelbarrow. I mean, those are the basic tools that I use, and plus like a stirrup hoe for cultivating and cutting out crops. I have a drill-powered Harrow, but that ended up breaking. The tines ended up breaking on me, so I only used that for about the past year until it broke earlier this year. Okay.
And what kind of, we should maybe get an idea of what kind of soil you're working on there, because I'd like to hear a little bit about your soil practices. So what's the base like? What's your native soil like?
Locally, it's called gumbo clay, and it's a very, very heavy clay. If it gets wet, it's very sticky and impossible to work with. And when it dries, it becomes a brick. You could build a house out of this native soil if you were so minded. So it's very, very heavy. It's very compacted. Which means that when I'm opening up new ground, I often can smell the anaerobic decomposition in that clay. And so you've been taking a lot of compost. But after the initial working of just broad forking once or twice, it starts to loosen up a lot. And I use a lot of compost. I use a mixture of what would be considered deep compost mulch, and I don't know what you guys usually calling it, but I'm not. But I'm combining it with not using much compost and instead trying to just create a nice tilt on the top. I find that my compost does not hold water very well. So if I try to lay down compost and then seed into that, it doesn't really hold water well enough to germinate as well as I need it to. And so I use as much compost as I can, but also I'm trying to balance that with having enough water retention on the surface to germinate things. But I'll lay down a lot of compost, a few inches to get started, and then at least an inch or more every year. And I'm just kind of feeling out the soil as I go. Some places need a lot more than others. I have some areas that have a lot of rocks and some that do not have many rocks at all. And so if there's a lot of rocks, I'm going to add more compost to try to build on top of those rocks, because I can't spend all day, every day picking rocks out of a very small area when there's that many. And I've done some stuff with cover crops. I love the results, but I just haven't integrated cover crops into my systems well enough for it to be a consistent thing that I'm doing, although I want to do it more. That has really, doing cover crops, I noticed where I have done it, the soil tilt definitely improved and the crops were happy afterwards. So I'm just playing with a lot of different things to figure out what is going to work best for me.
So when you're doing the broad forking, are you doing that before you're putting the compost on, or are you doing that after you layer on some compost and then broad fork to try and get that compost worked in there a little bit, or how's that go?
That's actually a good question. When I do it in the beginning, I will lay down the compost and then broad fork to try to get that compost down deeper. And then subsequently, I'll usually broad fork and then put the compost on top, just because if I lay down a bunch of compost and then broad fork, it causes the compost to just go everywhere. And so then I have to scrape back up the compost to reshape the bed. And so it just adds a lot of extra labor. So on the subsequent times, I'll just lay it on top after the broad forking, and I'll let the earthworms and such come up and move it about.
Are you having issues with heat at all? Like, one of our issues in the summer is that compost is dark, and our summer suns can be really intense here in Kentucky, and I'm sure that's even amplified there. Are you having issues with getting too hot for transplants or for seeding?
It's actually not such. It doesn't actually matter whether I use compost or not, because my soil itself is a very dark gray / black clay, and so that's gonna gather a lot of heat anyway. And so the compost it doesn't really make much of a difference in that way. The heat is a big problem here during summer. As I said, it gets high 90s as the average for every day. And so I've been using a lot of shade cloth. However, shade cloth has been I haven't been as successful with it as I'd like. I've used overhead irrigation for a very long time, and that's as I'm working on other problems in my system, I'm beginning to notice more and more that the overhead itself is an issue. Because what would happen is that I put shade cloth over hoops over all the crops. Since I'm so far south, everything grows under 30% shade, which is great because everything that I grow appreciates it. I'm a salad farm. I should have mentioned that before, sorry. I'm a salad farm, and so I'm growing baby greens, lettuce, radishes, turnips, carrots, and then like cucumbers and tomatoes. And so with that being the case, basically everything I grow appreciates at least some shade during the summer. And so I'll put 30% shade cloth over hoops, over the crops in the field, and then I'll water over the top of it with overhead. And this ends up resulting in a lot of humidity in the area because the shade cloth will end up holding in a lot of humidity. And so then with high heat and high humidity, I've been having a lot of diseases in the crops that have just been degrading quality and causing problems with optimal growth.
Yeah, that combination. I mean, I know that I've seen, we do a little of that. I try and get the shade cloth off as fast as possible for that reason. But I can see, I mean, that especially it's even more amplified in your situation. Are you doing those cucumbers and tomato crops? Are those in your tunnel then?
Yeah, I'll grow those in tunnels, and those are obviously on drip. Because of the issue with overhead that I realized this summer. I'm now working on putting everything on a drip and overhead combination so that the primary can be drip. But yeah, I'm growing the cucumbers and tomatoes under tunnels.
What's your water source there? Are you doing, or is this out of a well, or you got, I mean, it sounds like you all get a decent amount of rain.
This is expensive city water. It's well water technically, but it's coming from a co-op so I'm paying for that water.
Mm. Right. So maybe even more incentive to use drip.
Yeah. You read some things initially when I first began that made me hesitant about drip because it sounded like it'd be a real pain to work with. And then plus drip just costs a lot more per square foot than overhead does. And so that's a significant reason why I went with overhead. But the more I've been going, the more I'm realizing that having drip as the primary system is probably better for the sake of humidity. So now I've bought enough drip to cover my whole farm, and I'm just slowly implementing it.
Mm. Yeah, drip can be a challenge in terms of laying it out. I mean, one of the labor involved, but you said a quarter acre, your beds are kind of shorter. Then I could see that being more cost effective for you. And the one issue that we had that sounds like you've sort of are addressing anyway is the tilth element, because when you have compost that's somewhat hydrophobic or just drains the water really quickly, drip is really hard to use in that scenario. But if you have some combination of compost and soil as your growing medium in those first 4 inches, then it's going to be a little bit more receptive to that drip.
Exactly. That's why I actually initially bought that Harrow, was to try to do a very low till and just mix the clay and compost together, because that clay would then help to hold the water while the compost is helping to improve the soil quality. And that helped a lot. But as I said, the Harrow broke, and I was also just finding it to be quite annoying to be constantly using that and relying on a moving part in the system, because the more I was relying on that, the more delays I'd end up having every time the soil just wasn't. If the clay was a little bit too wet, it would get all stuck up in the Harrow, and so I haven't really done anything to get a new Harrow once this current one broke, because it just seemed to be easier to farm without it. But yeah, the drip isn't great for germinating stuff. And so that's why I'm going to have a combination system. And plus I'm working on using also things like landscape fabric over the top of the bed while the seeds are germinating to try to hold in extra water. And that seems to be working decently well.
Okay, I've got 2 questions there then. The one is, what are you using instead of the Harrow?
Well, I'm not really using anything. I just use a rake to get the tilth to being enough to use. Because I have a jang, and so the jang is pretty sturdy in terms of going over pretty much any soil texture. And I actually learned this from Rose Creek. I use a metal dibbler that I attach to a drill, and so by doing that, I basically drill all the holes for my transplants using the little dibbler. And by having that little hole, I can just drop the transplant right in the hole, and I don't have to worry so much about the soil being loose enough for me to make a hole with my finger. So that's been very helpful for when it's really wet or if it's just a bit too firm. And it also speeds up transplanting a lot.
When you say dibbler, are you talking about like a little auger bit, or is it just something you're poking straight in the soil and then taking out?
It's like an auger bit. I got it from Two Bad Cats. It's just a little metal dibbler that they use on those row markers. Have you seen the spinning row markers with the metal dibblers that you run down the row? I think JM uses them.
Yeah.
I'm just using one of those little metal dibblers, and I attach it to the drill, and doing that, the drill just spins it fast enough that it pushes open a hole in that. And if the soil is moist enough, the hole will stay open, and then that's when I can drop the plug transplant into.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, I use, they have don't they have a bunch of hand dibblers too? I feel like they have a bunch of different options like that Too Bad Cats does?
The hand nibblers don't work so well in that they're just pushing in, and then the soil gets stuck to the side of it, and it doesn't really make a neat hole. Whereas by having the drill spinning the dibbler, it makes it so that it's a very nice, firm, open hole for you to drop the transplant into.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I use depending on what it is. If it's not a lot, I can use a drill with an auger bit. And I haven't tried that dibble. That's an interesting variation. But I've used the auger bit, and even the big auger bit for I think it's like a 3 or 4 inch diameter one that we'll use for tomatoes. Is there a bigger option for that, or do you do that differently when you're doing things like tomato transplants?
I just had to get an auger bit the same as you for the tomato transplant. The dibbler from Too Bad Cats works for like 128 cell to a 200 cell size plugs. And I mean, this credit where credit's due. This is something I learned from Rose Creek Farms. But this is what they do for their transplants.
Hey, you all, just jumping in here real quick to get a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Farmers Web. Farmers Web software gives you the tools you need to manage your entire sales process. Built specifically for farmers' needs, Farmers Web helps you to save time, reduce errors, increase efficiency, and provides flexibility for working seamlessly with your whole customer base. Visit farmersweb.com to schedule a demo, try their free account or a 1-month free trial of their paid accounts, and don't forget to check out their free how-to guides on selling online to individual buyers, as well as how to work with such buyers as restaurants, schools, and stores at www.farmersweb.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crop, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. All right, back to the show. The other question I had a minute ago was about you said that you were doing landscape fabric over top of crops to get them to germinate. I use a similar thing, but what's your process there?
I mean, it's just I'm watering it in very heavily, and then I'll pull landscape fabric over the top and then continue to use overhead to try to keep the moisture level under that fabric high, whilst the fabric helps to try to reduce evaporation. I only began trying it out this summer, and it's worked moderately. The issue I had with the landscape fabric is that it doesn't actually allow through enough of the overhead water to evenly moisten the soil underneath, and so it was keeping in the initial watering, but it wasn't really allowing more water to come in. And that's why it has only worked moderately well. So I think I'm going to either find a looser weave fabric to use, or I think I might try using burlap, although I don't know how well that has worked for people who have used it. Right.
We don't use landscape fabric, but we use the silage tarps, because in the summertime, we're not using the silage tarps. So we'll throw them over white side up. And especially over things like carrots, and they'll germinate really well because they don't allow any moisture to escape. And that's been relatively effective. The one challenge, and maybe you can speak to this too, is when you pull those tarps off, you have to be really smart about it. Because if you pull them off in the morning when things are germinated, and they're, obviously you have to be on it, you have to know when that stuff's germinating. Because it can't get too leggy, but you pull that off and it's boiling hot sun, it can fry up all your starts, all your seedlings. So what's your approach there? Have you found anything that's worked?
Oh yeah. I'm tracking the progression of them, and I target to pull it off in the evening, right before the sun goes down, and I'm going to pull it off right when the seedlings are just barely poking above the soil. That way they really begin to open up in the middle of the night, and the sun comes up and they're already adjusted to their being light, as opposed to there being the shock. And then I'm going to water well and hope for the best.
Right. We mentioned, some of the challenges Can you give us an idea of some of the things that you've tried in terms of soil management that have been really helpful for you? Like any big aha sort of moments in your soil management that you think would be worth sharing? Or you could go the other direction if there's anything you've tried that you felt like you didn't work super well.
Yeah, I think something that has worked quite well is I often, when a crop is done, I pull landscape fabric or silage tarp over it to decompose it. And in doing that, I'm not wasting any of the crop remains. And the soil life seems to really love to eat whatever's left over. And during summer, I mean, that will all degrade in a week to 2 weeks, especially if it's like baby greens. And when I'm pulling it off, the soil under there looks really nice. Similar, I mean, if I'm doing a cover crop, if I mow down the cover crop and it's silage tarp, whenever I pull it off, the soil is always super beautiful. And using that in combination with compost, a lot of compost, then the soil life really seems to enjoy to eat the crop remains plus the compost underneath. So long as there's enough moisture, that seems to have been something that has helped more than anything else in terms of building my soil. I think because I'm not scraping off any of the soil, and I'm not wasting that plant matter by removing it and taking it off to a compost pile. Because I do not really do my own composting. I'm not very good at it, and I'm not producing enough waste to really incentivize me to really want to become good at it. And so if I can somehow find a way to compost that stuff in place and thus feed the soil in that way, that's what I've been doing. And so since I'm growing high turnaround crops, it works quite easily to just decompose like the baby green leftovers in place and then pull it off a week to 2 weeks later. And then I'm going to broad fork the bed and then seed again.
So the process with that is essentially you're harvesting whatever you needed off the crop. If it's a baby green or something, you're mowing it. Can you kind of take us through that?
Yeah. So if it's a baby green and it grows up a bit, then I'll mow it. But usually, if I time it properly, I'm usually bad at timing things properly because I'm never on schedule as well as I would like to be. But the ideal situation is where if it's a baby green, I take the quick cut greens harvester through. I'm harvesting the crop, and then what's left behind is not very tall to begin with, and so I just pull the landscape fabric right over that, and that's it. And so it's very simple in that way. But if I end up not getting to it for a few more days, then those baby greens will begin to grow back, and then in that case, I'll mow it down before covering it up.
Okay, and then you're getting it super wet, and basically it's decomposing underneath that landscape fabric.
Exactly. I'll make sure to water it. I'll water it thoroughly, and then I'll let it decompose under the fabric.
Yeah, I'll bet that happens even faster in your climate too.
Exactly. When it's 97 degrees in the summer and I'm covering it up in black, it's something that's not allowing any light through. It's like a compost pile in many ways, and it's just dissolving very, very quickly.
Right. Was there anything that you wanted to mention in terms of things that maybe haven't worked as well and that you've tried in terms of soil management?
This is something that I mostly struggled with in the beginning was using enough fertilizer. In the beginning, I wanted to use very low fertilizer and rely on compost to be the main source of fertility, and that really did not work. My soil itself is very depleted of nutrients. And so when I was trying to use this a low fertilizer and lots of compost, the plants were not having very much fun. And so I just ended up increasing that. And even though it was higher than what would have initially been recommended, it seems to have worked quite well. And I don't know, that was something that bothered me very much in the beginning, was that I wanted to use very little fertilizer to try to be as eco-friendly as possible, in a sense of not having to bring in as much stuff from outside of the farm. And it just really did not work as well as I wanted it to. If I had way more time and a lot more cover crop time, I'm sure it could have worked, but in my instance, I didn't really have that time. And so I just spent money on bringing in composted chicken manure and using a lot of that.
Okay, so what's the process there? Is it exclusively the composted chicken manure? Are you doing this off soil tests, or like what's your sort of process for deciding on the fertilizer?
Um, I've done soil tests to get a basic idea of fertility, and then I'm using just composted chicken manure and in combination with the compost that I used to begin with. The composted chicken manure is a very high fertility, and so I'll use a little bit of that in combination with like my inch of compost. The compost that I get is just green waste, composted by the city. So I'll spread the compost, and then I'm using fertilizer based on how the previous crop has performed and what the next crop will be. So if it's baby greens or lettuce, I'm going to use more than if it's going to be a root crop, as root crops aren't going to appreciate the nitrogen as much. And then I'm also trying to be mindful of what the runoff situation would be if I have a lot of rainfall. And I mean, it has really been a matter of just figuring out how best it was going to work along the way. I initially went off of Ray Tyler. I don't remember when he first talked about this, but he was trying to grow lettuce during the summer. And at one point, he ended up just using a pound of fertilizer per linear foot of growing bed. And he was using composted chicken manure as well. And that's when his summer lettuce started to do really well. And since I was having really terrible luck growing summer greens and such, I just upped my fertilizer rate to something similar to his, and then started to work back down as things improved. So I'm using way less than I did. I'm using way less than that initial amount, but that's what I guess I really needed to get things to really start growing at a proper rate.
I do feel like it is a trend that people want to use very little in the beginning, and it's kind of the time that you have to use some because your biology is not really reestablished, especially if it's a new growing bed or if it's been depleted at all. That's when you probably want to be focusing a little bit more on giving your plants some initial nitrogen to give them that burst. But I think that is something that is good to know, is like that you started out low, then you went up high, and then you've been able to back off a little bit.
Yeah, I've been backing off and just trying to watch the plants. And because I'm such a high turnaround, because I'm growing very short age to maturity crops, and so I'm going to do several crops in each bed, and it's just randomly rotating around the farm. I can't do soil tests of blocks as well, because based on which different crops went through a bed will determine how much fertilizer that bed actually got. And so some places will have had significantly more than others. And so I'm not doing like a set fertility regimen of like, okay, I'm going to do this much for the season based on these soil tests. I'm instead just watching the crops and considering what was there previously and how much fertility they were given and what's going in next to try to judge what to next do.
Right. Yeah. So I'm just thinking like you've been doing this for a few years now. What do the next few years look like for you? Like, what are your goals with the farm and how do you want to develop it?
Yeah. So this is my fourth year of growing, and I'm 17. And so I'm still living with my parents, and my farm is certainly a very small farm still. I certainly never achieved the $100,000 on a quarter acre like I initially saw in the first Curtis Stone video I watched. My goal is just to continue to grow it, and I want to pursue farming as a career, at least in the moderate term. So I'm going to try to push to produce more, and I'll probably expand from beyond just this food hub. COVID gave a very big boom to the food hub, and then it's kind of since petered out. And so my initial hopes for it seem to have been a little bit too high, considering the current interest in local food now that the COVID boom has dissipated. So I'll just be looking to continue to expand. I would think I want to move more towards more retail customers. A significant amount of my product is going to restaurants right now. and I kind of prefer the idea of feeding people's families directly as opposed to it going to a restaurant and then being turned into a dish there.
Do you have any reservations or feelings about farmers markets? Is that something that you're considering, or is it something you're avoiding?
I did a farmers market for a year and a half. There's something, I think farmers markets are a great sales outlet, and they're a very beautiful sales outlet, and that you're able to interact directly with the customer. And I think I'm going to do them in the future again. I mostly just dislike them in that they're often not as steady as you'd like them to be. They ebb and flow during the seasons, and if there's bad weather, then suddenly you have a really terrible week there. And so maybe if I go to a really big market, since I am near Dallas, there's some very big markets near here where I guess the customers are a bit more steady because it's like indoors and such. So I think I'll probably expand to one of those in the future. But since my farm is so small right now, I can't really afford to go to a large farmers market just due to the fact that I don't have enough volume.
Is that your biggest sort of holdup? Is your biggest obstacle is production, or do you feel like there are other things that are keeping you from getting to that goal of expanding your markets and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it is mostly production. I'm nowhere near as good of a farmer as I'd like to be or could be, and in many ways that seems to be the holdup. Also, though, because I'm at such a small scale, if I expand, like for example, if I expand arugula production by just planting one more bed of it, I'm potentially increasing my arugula production by 50 to 100%, and so in that way, it can be a bit difficult in that if I don't immediately have a sales outlet for that place, I'm suddenly producing way more arugula than I currently have sales for. And so I think it'll just be a bit of a trying to jump from this level to a bit higher of a level. But after this year, with everything that I've learned with like the irrigation and slowly figuring out my soil practices, I think I'm going to be able to finally begin to increase production to a level that allows me to expand my markets.
Yeah, I feel like, with growing, it takes at least, a year to figure out your soil bare minimum. And then once you have it figured out, you have to spend another year getting it tuned up. And then, a year figuring out your markets. And so it seems like about that 4 or 5 year mark, you start to see the picture and get humming. Do you feel like you're vaguely there? Like, do you feel like with those things that you took into consideration that you're kind of heading in that direction?
I think so. And a significant amount of it, though, is just that when I first started, I was starting off with such little infrastructure. And so that delayed a lot of things. Like, I was really figuring out very basic things in the very beginning, partly because I wasn't able to spend $10,000, $20,000 buying a bunch of different things and then being able to try all of those in the first year or two. I instead started at a much lower level and ended up trying those in year 2 and year 3 and finding out which did and didn't work. And so that kind of slowed me down. But since this is something that I'm doing while living with my parents, and since I'm homeschooled, it's not as much of an issue for me to be able to, for me to not be producing at the same kind of level as you are, as I obviously don't have a family that I'm trying to support off of it.
Right. Well, you're getting good practice for when that happens. What's your next infrastructure improvement or equipment improvement? Like, what do you feel like you're lacking there?
Every time I think about it, it's always covered growing. The more covered space I can have on my farm, the better, and that it's just more control, and like one example is that doing shade cloth, I was putting shade cloth over field hoops, like we would put frost cloth over. And this meant that I was watering over the top of it with overhead irrigation. But once I have caterpillar tunnels or high tunnels, I will be able to put the shade cloth over the top of the tunnel. And now I'm not having issues with the water being on top of the shade cloth and creating very, very high humidity environment. And so in that way, just little things like that will improve the growing significantly. So, I'm just looking at trying to put up more cat tunnels and grow more undercover.
Yeah, it's really incredible, especially in hotter climates, how how much of an improvement having that cover makes. Like, it just makes things grow better and happier. And it's tough because, it's expensive. That infrastructure is expensive. It's often a lot of plastic, but it does make for great crop production. And yeah, I think that's something that I see a lot more Southern growers looking more into. And I know Ray Tyler's championed this a lot, just putting more undercover. And I definitely see a value there.
Yeah, Ray Tyler relatively recently put his entire farm under caterpillar tunnels. Like, there's a grower saying, yeah, caterpillar tunnels are the way to go. The big issue I think right now, though, for growers, if they want to put up more cover growing, is just that steel prices basically doubled, and so now greenhouses cost almost double now also.
Yeah, and that makes it all the more challenging, winter growing and summer growing.
Exactly.
You said you weren't making your own compost, but you're able to purchase enough compost for your production that you're good with the quality and all those things?
Yes, I'm actually incredibly lucky in this way. There's a very good municipal composting program, and it's based out of a city very close to Dallas, and their composting facility is actually only 15 minutes away from me, and they make a very beautiful green-based compost. So they're using yard waste and vegetable scraps and such for it, and so it's not very high in fertility, but it's very high in organic matter, and it has a very nice tilt, and most importantly, it's incredibly biologically active. After I receive it, if it sits for 2 days and I start to break into it, it's just covered in white fungus. And so being able to use that on my farm has really helped in adding life to the soil. And so with it being that way, I can never make compost on my farm as good as I can buy it from that company. I think they have won some awards nationally for their compost, actually. So I'm very happy with it. The only thing about their compost that's a bit of a drawback is that their composting facility is right next to a landfill. And so this seems to result in little bits of trash blowing onto their windrows. And so there's a small percentage of little plastic bits in their compost that they aren't able to filter out. And so that's the only real negative about their compost. But in every other way, I'm very happy with it.
Yeah, and I honestly rarely find any compost that doesn't have some amount of plastic in it. It's just it's the nature of it. What happens, I think, a lot of times they take in things like wood chips, and for as much as I love my wood chippers and really appreciate them, they often don't treat their wood chips any different than they treat trash. So they throw their garbage in there, and that's how it ends up in the landfills, and you can't get it all out. So it's that can be unfortunate, finding plastic in your compost. And but no, it sounds like a good setup for the most part.
Yeah, and my composted chicken manure also is there. It's a very high quality fertilizer, and it's also very biologically active. It has lots of fungal growth in it also, and so in those ways, I'm able to really inoculate my soil to a level at which I'm quite happy with. So it's mostly just a matter of getting that going year after year and slowly building up the soil.
And I don't think you said you were, but you're not certified organic, are you?
No, I'm definitely not. There was a point where I actually was a small enough farm where, in the very beginning, where I could have claimed to be organic without it being an issue. Because if you're under $5,000 of sales a year, you can claim to be organic without being certified. But that was only the first year, and it was never the label that really interested me. And that, while I know that there's a lot of value to it, since I'm selling mostly to customers that know about my farm, like they know what I'm doing and they know me and they can ask me questions, it's not something where I'm really needing a label on my product to sell it for me. Whereas if I was selling in grocery stores and such, then I can see it being a lot more of a valuable thing to have.
Yeah. And for us, like, yeah, and I've said it many times on the podcast, just we find the value at the farmers market, but if we weren't doing a farmers market, I don't think we would certify. I wouldn't necessarily see the value, and it just depends on who your market is.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe the kind of the last question I have is, like, I'm thinking about parents who have children maybe your age or a little bit younger who would love to see their kids get into it. And you mentioned your dad getting into, gardening, getting you into gardening at a young age. Is there anything they've done right that you feel like that was really great and that really helped you to get started?
They've been incredibly supportive. I mean, and in every way. I've always been very entrepreneurial since I was a little kid, and so that's a significant reason why I began doing this. Like, I enjoyed growing things, and I was always seeking ways to be able to sell things, and so this was a very easy business for me to get into from younger me's perspective. Had I known all the difficulties then, maybe I wouldn't have been so gung-ho about it, but my parents were always very supportive about it. And I'm homeschooled, and they've given me a lot of leeway to be able to run my farm. And so, I mean, they haven't really actually done anything on the farm. It's been entirely me doing it, with the exception being that, like, when I can't drive, obviously they're the ones that are driving me to the markets and helping me make the deliveries and such. And in the very beginning, they also are responsible for some of the loans that I took out. That initial $1,200 was nowhere near what I needed, and so they were generous enough to loan me some money and being able to continue to grow the farm. But I mean, in general, it's just been comprehensive support, and that's what has allowed me to create the farm that I have today.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dawson, I thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure to chat with you, and I appreciate so much your support, and I look forward to just keeping an eye on what you're up to, and it's really impressive.
Thanks, Jesse. I really appreciate you having me on today, and I've definitely admired your work and all the other people who are advancing the no-till way.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to give Dawson a follow on Instagram and all the places. We will hook it up with links in the show notes. Also, you can support our work at no-tillgrowers.com by picking up a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook. Proceeds from that sale at no-tillgrowers.com go to making you more free content. Hats are the same way, but they may very well be sold out by the time you hear this, so sorry. But whenever you see them, just know that buying a hat supports our freely available content. And, of course, there is the patreon.com/no-tillgrowers route as well. That's also incredibly helpful. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it and leave a review. But this week, all reviews must discuss what a fascinating piece of history that new Beatles Get Back documentary it is. It's so weird and so wonderful. Today's episode was brought to you in part by a grant from Southern SARE. Big thanks to Jackson Roulette, Josh Satin, Willie Breeding for the theme music, and of course, my amazing wife, Hannah Crabtree. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.